What is the opioid epidemic and how did it start? The opioid epidemic is a crisis that is caused by the increased misuse of opioids, leading to addictions or overdoses. The opioid epidemic has gone by in waves, and the first wave started in the 1990s due to doctors overprescribing opioids. This led to an increase in addictions and overdoses. One event that exacerbated the start of the opioid epidemic was the creation of Oxycontin in 1996. The Sackler family, also known as Purdue Pharma, created Oxycontin as an anti-addiction drug. This turned out to be false advertising, which led to many new addictions and overdoses. Their false advertising and misinformation led to an increase in opioid addictions. This escalated the opioid epidemic in Pennsylvania, which needs to be controlled. The governors of Pennsylvania, Josh Shapiro and Tom Wolf, have been working hard at trying to combat the opioid epidemic. Josh Shapiro was Attorney General before he was the governor, and he helped to settle many lawsuits against drug companies. Tom Wolf set up many opioid addiction-related programs and helped to increase treatment plans. A significant problem surrounding the opioid epidemic is the negative stigma many people face. Healthcare providers and law enforcement officers are some of the most common people with negative attitudes towards opioid addictions. There should especially be no negative stigma from healthcare providers and law enforcement because these people should be the ones helping the people in need. Healthcare providers in all of Pennsylvania have been called out for their negative attitudes towards the opioid addiction. The PA Opioid and Substance Use Disorder Stigma Campaign has been speaking out on stopping stigma in Pennsylvania, especially with medical providers. Western and Central Pennsylvania law enforcement officers were found to have a negative stigma about the opioid epidemic. Opioid addictions are still increasing in Pennsylvania every day, along with opioid-related deaths. I want to inform everyone about how the opioid epidemic started and why people with opioid addiction should not be treated as criminals or bad people. Law enforcement officers and healthcare providers should try their hardest to help people suffering from an addiction and not just see them as a waste of time. The false advertisement and misinformation of Oxycontin that Purdue Pharma created caused increased opioid addictions in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, resulting in the opioid epidemic. Also, opioid addiction should be treated as a disease and there should be no stigma around it, especially from law enforcement officers from Western and Central Pennsylvania and the healthcare workers from Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. The opioid epidemic, which is a rapid increase in addiction and overdoses from opioids and opiates, is a severe problem in Pennsylvania. The opioid epidemic first started with the discovery of the opium poppy, and it was then worsened by healthcare providers freely prescribing opioids to patients. The opioid epidemic is a severe crisis that is plaguing all of the United States, including Pennsylvania. Looking at this map, Pennsylvania is considered to have the rate of opioid-related deaths that is significantly higher than the United States as a whole. Opioids come from the opium poppy, which was first found in the 1800s. It was then marketed to physicians to help alleviate pain, but very few regulations were implemented. With no limits, physicians prescribed opioids freely to their patients for any discomfort. This caused rapid increases in opioid addiction and overdoses. In the 1990s, there was an increase in the prescription of opioids. The opioid epidemic has gone in three waves. First were prescription opioids in the 1990s. Then was an increase in heroin overdoses, and finally around 2013, there was an increase in synthetic opioid-related deaths. There is also now a fourth wave, which includes fentanyl, and this video will help to explain that a little better.
It's raging nationwide.
The opioid crisis is an ongoing silent killer in Pennsylvania and the country,
and showing no signs of slowing down.
We often talk about the opioid crisis in waves, and the fourth wave is being considered the fentanyl wave.
Dr. Asif Ilyas is the president of the Rothman Opioid Foundation and a professor at Thomas Jefferson University. Knowing the risk of addiction, Ilyas says doctors are giving fewer opioids, prescribing 30 to 40% less, according to Rothman's research. But a deadly trend persists.
We're not necessarily seeing a decrease in opioid-related deaths, and that's really because now what's driving deaths from opioids is not prescription opioids, but it's really fentanyl.
There are also many different types of drugs that fall under the opioid category. Some include heroin, oxycodone, morphine, fentanyl, and many more listed in this picture above. All of these different drugs contribute to the opioid epidemic in Pennsylvania. Purdue Pharma played a significant role in the start of the opioid epidemic in Pennsylvania by falsely advertising Oxycontin. Purdue Pharma was a contributing factor to what made the opioid epidemic so severe. They created Oxycontin and advertised it as non-addictive. Purdue just wanted to make a profit off vulnerable people. They claimed that Oxycontin was less addictive than other opioids, even though they knew this was not true. They also knew that people were misusing them by crushing them, and they did nothing about it. This lie led to a massive increase in opioid addictions and overdoses. Their false advertising and misinformation helped to start the opioid epidemic, and they still will not own up to it. Purdue Pharma was aware of the issues OxyContin would cause and still allowed the FDA to approve it. Purdue Pharma visited 531,000 doctors' offices and pharmacies in Pennsylvania and made sure to promote OxyContin to doctors they knew would overprescribe or even illegally prescribe them. As you can see in this map, almost all of the states in America have filed lawsuits against Purdue Pharma, including Pennsylvania. In Pennsylvania, Purdue targeted doctors who already had suspicious prescribing activities, and they pushed OxyContin sales on these doctors. They also misinformed doctors about how addictive OxyContin truly was. Purdue also created something called pseudo-addiction, which was a Purdue-conjured disease that showed similar symptoms as an addiction, but was to be treated, according to Purdue, with additional opioids. All of these claims greatly affected Pennsylvania. Josh Shapiro and Tom Wolf have done a lot to help combat the opioid epidemic in Pennsylvania. As Attorney General, Josh Shapiro fought against drug companies to win lawsuits, and as Governor, Tom Wolf created programs to help with treatment plans. The recent governors of Pennsylvania, Tom Wolf and Josh Shapiro, have done a lot to combat the opioid epidemic. As Attorney General, Josh Shapiro has won many lawsuits to get money for opioid addiction treatment plans. Again, Purdue sales representatives visited 531,000 doctors' offices or pharmacies in Pennsylvania to spread their false marketing. As Attorney General, Josh Shapiro created a lawsuit against Purdue Pharma due to their illegal marketing of OxyContin in Pennsylvania. He argued that Purdue's representatives barraged Pennsylvanian doctors and pushed addictive opioids on them. Shapiro spoke out against Purdue and said the opioid epidemic was manufactured in part by Purdue Pharma, as the company deceptively marketed OxyContin despite knowing the risk of addiction. While Pennsylvania paid the price, Purdue made more than $35 billion in revenue. We're taking action to hold them accountable for their greed and the devastation they pushed for profit. Purdue only cared about making a profit and not all of the lives that they destroyed. He has also gotten drug dealers off the streets, and he has taken steps to combat the opioid epidemic. So now, before I move on to what Wolf has done for Pennsylvania, I'm going to show a short video of Shapiro talking about the epidemic.
60% of those who are prescribed prescription opioids end up with leftover pills. And 70% of those who misuse opioids get them from a friend or a relative's medicine cabinet. Purdue's OxyContin's sole active ingredient, oxycodone, is a molecule nearly identical to heroin. That's how we ended up with 4 out of every 5 heroin users starting with a legal prescription drug like Oxy.
So now I'm going to move on to what Governor Wolf did in Pennsylvania. Governor Wolf expanded Medicaid in 2015, which allowed more people with opioid addictions to access treatment. This helped thousands of Pennsylvanians not to suffer without the help they needed. He also launched programs to stop the opioid epidemic. Wolf also distributed naloxone, a reversal drug, to first responders, schools, and police departments. He improved prescribing guidelines so that the occurrence of new addictions would decrease. Shapiro and Wolf fought hard to stop the opioid epidemic here in Pennsylvania. The fight against Purdue Pharma is very important, but there is also something else that we should be focusing on. There is a high amount of stigma around the opioid epidemic in Pennsylvania, especially among law enforcement officers and medical providers. Stigma is a huge deal when it comes to addiction. Negative attitudes towards opioid addicts do not help them at all. This makes these people feel scared and ashamed, and they will be less likely to seek help. These cycles of stigma diagram help to show what these people go through. It all starts with public stigma that turns into discrimination, which damages one's self-esteem. This then turns into self-stigma, which will then turn into shame. After these people feel ashamed of themselves, they will no longer want to seek help or treatment. This will then cause increased addiction or overdose. Stigma will not help solve the opioid epidemic in Pennsylvania. Stigma from first providers or medical providers is the worst form of stigma. A study done on law enforcement officers in western and central Pennsylvania helped prove provider-based stigma. It focused on whether or not officers decided to use naloxone when someone was overdosing. Most of these officers had negative thoughts and attitudes about administering the drug because they thought it was a waste of time. This is a big problem in Pennsylvania. PA Opioid and Substance Use Disorder Stigma Campaign has been trying to end stigma in Pennsylvania. It talks about first responders and medical providers and how they can end stigma. Care providers need to be more careful about the words they use and their attitudes towards a person. This is a picture of a flyer about this campaign. Their main goal is to reduce stigma in Pennsylvania towards substance use. It has helped to change people's views on the opioid epidemic and has also helped opioid addicts feel safer and less ashamed. Ending these negative attitudes towards people with addictions is the first part of ending the opioid epidemic here in Pennsylvania. The opioid epidemic is a serious threat to Pennsylvania and all of the United States today. This all started back in the 1800s when the opium poppy was discovered. Physicians were freely and carelessly prescribing opioids to patients who did not need them. This caused a spike in opioid addictions. Also, the creation of OxyContin created the first wave of opioid overdoses. Purdue Pharma spread false information about OxyContin, claiming it was non-addictive. This was untrue, and the number of opioid addictions and overdoses skyrocketed. The governors of Pennsylvania have been trying to combat the opioid epidemic by setting up new programs and settling lawsuits. There is so much negative stigma around opioid addictions that needs to be ended. Law enforcement officers and healthcare providers must treat all people with the same respect, even if they have an addiction. We must eliminate the negative stigma towards drug addictions and start helping these people. Addiction is a disease and needs to be taken seriously. We all need to work towards ending the opioid epidemic and helping these people get the treatment they need. The fight against Purdue Pharma is a critical aspect of combating the epidemic here in Pennsylvania. Our governors have done whatever they can to hold Purdue Pharma accountable for their actions. The fight against the epidemic is not over, and we should all do whatever we can to end it.